No, because you have to have a sign note from your mom and a helmet there. So I don't see you have either of those. Oh, so that would work.
That would work, right?
I think so. I'm not in charge. Wait, do they have horses here? Oh, I have horses.
So I think that's what the horses are doing.
Well, this will be the first day that actually.
So I'm wondering if that's why the horse fell down.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah, Kelly Franklin. Yeah, Ralph, come on. We ready? There we go. Well, welcome back from spring break, everyone. Well, if you want, well, I guess it snowed here last Wednesday, didn't it? Was it Tuesday there? It rained 4 inches. That was like a snowstorm for them. So they have enough rain. They can send it our way. Oh, man. And then 2 days ago, what was that? That was plain storm, just storm. What? Plain old Kansas, yep. That's how I clean my yard. Clean yard. Oh, it's time. Yeah, green stuff is coming up, and it's humid today. I wore a vest and to roll up my shirts. All right, well, welcome back. We ended last week with the first part of a 3-part telling of the Ukraine and Mennonites in Ukraine story. We had talked about, or I had talked about it in terms of, you can tell it in terms of sort of 3 different paradoxes: power and promise, pathos and tragedy, paradox and irony. We finished the power and promise stuff, and now we're going to start working on the pathos and tragedy. It picks up the story after the golden age of Mennonites. And that's where we left off the story, with the question of wondering, what would it have been like if there hadn't been a revolution in Russia? Well, the point is, there was revolution. But let's talk about that a little bit. A reminder again that none of this stuff is really my own research. This is from a book called The Mennonite Story in Ukraine by Paul Taves, from his Heritage Cruise lectures. So just remember that. And so if you find something super intelligent, you could give me the credit, but if you disagree with it, that's Paul Taves' fault, not mine. All right, pathos and tragedy. Pathos means, we get, what words do we? Empathetic, sympathetic, we get from the idea of pain, of sorrow, of feeling with someone. What might that mean? In April of 1918, 2 years before this church became its own church, we were meeting already in the old church building here, but in 1918, a train filled with German troops arrived in Hauptstadt in the colony of Molochna. Remember, here's the area. This is the Crimean Peninsula. This is the Ukraine area. Here's some of the names you know now. Kyiv is right here. This is what the borders looked like in 1916. And we're talking 1918 now. This is Molochna. And there's a town called Hauptstadt. That was like the capital of the Molochna colony. Today it's called Malachansk, and the Russians have taken it over. In fact, there's a place called the Mennonite Center. They evicted all the Mennonites. They'd been using the Mennonite Center to help with orphans and widows and that sort of thing. The Russian army has evicted them and taken over the building, which was still an original Mennonite building, and they're using it as a military center. It was such a nice place. You're absolutely right. It was a very nice place, and the Russian army has now taken it over, and still, as far as we know, well, they still control that area. Anyways, in 1918, a train filled with German troops arrived in that area. They appeared as a result of, now I don't want to get too boring with treaties and all that stuff, but I think this is very interesting. They appeared as a result of the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. I'm just going to call it the Treaty of Brest. That's what it is also referred to, which ended the Russian and German World War I hostilities. Because what happened is, you have World War I going on here in 1918 still. You have the Central Powers, or the Allied Powers, which are Great Britain and France. Later, the United States comes in, and you have the Central Powers, which are Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, and those sort of things. Anyways, they're fighting. Well, Russia is one of the Allied powers, and the Tsar of Russia has been fighting with Great Britain and France. Well, in the middle of fighting World War I, Russia has a revolution. And they get a whole new government. And the new government makes peace with the Imperial Germans and the Hungry Austrians and the Ottoman Empire. They make peace because they don't want, and Germany's been advancing. They've already taken over Poland. Poland is off the map again, and they've been pushing this way. And so they make a treaty with Germany. This is now Soviet Russia, not the Tsarist Russia. Makes a treaty with them to say, okay, let's not advance anymore. For us now, World War I is over. So that treaty's made with the Russian Bolsheviks, who have taken over in 1917. Now, just the interesting thing about this treaty, so what happened is Soviet Russia defaults on all of Imperial Russia's commitments to the Allies, and 11 nations become independent in Eastern Europe and in Western Asia. But more importantly, this whole area gets ceded to the Axis, or the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. This here is Ukraine. And not only that, they promise that these areas will become sovereign states. So for the first time in a long time, for the first time since the Mennonites, they got invited to come to that part of Russia because Russia had taken it over in the 1780s, something like that. Now, most all of Ukraine is set free, is actually under German control, but they sort of set up a puppet government. Now, and so the countries that are ceded are these Baltic states: Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Belarus, Poland doesn't exist, and Ukraine are some of the other ones, and then down here, Georgia and the Caucasus, the Ottoman Empire gets them. Why is that important? Well, those are also remember the Warsaw Pact, and those countries that the Soviet Union then invaded to start after World War II. We're not to World War II yet, but those countries all get taken back to Russia. They're also, though, the first countries that break off of the Soviet Union. And what's Putin trying to do now? Take them back again. So he's invaded here. Belarus is sort of a puppet state. And these guys, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, are worried. And there's Poland, too. Well, if they look at history, they ought to be worried, because history is repeating itself all over again today. So, anyways, what's important here now is our Mennonites are living right there by about that spot, and right there on the Crimean Peninsula. And now all of a sudden, they've been in the Imperial Russian Empire. Now all of a sudden, they are in free Ukraine. But free Ukraine's got some issues. The government that's been set up in Kyiv is immediately overthrown by the Bolsheviks, who have set up in Kharkiv. And so a civil war starts right away. Well, Germany needs their resources because they're being blockaded everywhere else. And they've made this deal with Ukraine that they'll get oil, they'll get grains, they'll get all sorts of other things. Well, they find out that this new government that they put in there, the sovereign independent government of Ukraine, is in civil war. So what do? They invade, or they occupy. Occupy, invade is a word that's used by, depending on who writes the history. They occupy and they take over and set up a government in Ukraine. So the Mennonites here, in a matter of a few months, they've already seen themselves through World War I. We're going to talk about that. All of a sudden, there's a revolution up in Moscow, or up in St. Petersburg. It's now called Leningrad. The Bolsheviks take over. There's a lot of stuff going on everywhere. All of a sudden, now in 1918, these German troops arrive by train in the Mennonite colony of Mleczna. How will they be received? And why are they received the way they are? I will mention one more thing about that Treaty of Brest. According to historian Spencer Tucker, and I think this is interesting, this is something I learned, and I quote him now, the German general staff had formulated extraordinarily harsh terms that shocked even the German negotiators when negotiating with Russia. When the Germans later complained that the 1919 Treaty of Versailles against Germany was too harsh on them, the Allied powers responded that it was much more benign than the terms imposed by the Brest Treaty that gave Germany all of this. And this is super trivial. It was also the first European treaty, war treaty, to be filmed. So they have movies of it. So there you go. You can go watch it somewhere online. Okay, what does all of this have to do with anything, with our nice little Plotich, Twebak eating, Borscht eating, Schinkenfleisch eating FASPA people on a Sunday afternoon in Mleczna? Well, Hauptstadt, when those Germans arrived, and there again we have modern day map, and you can see what the red line denotes. Everything to the right of the red line denotes where Russia has invaded now. When those Germans arrived, the Hauptstadt, the Mleczansk, which is now Mleczansk, high school, that's a Mennonite high school, greeted the German soldiers at the railway station with a rendition of the German national anthem, Deutschland über alles, Germany above all others. Do you know we have that tune in our hymnal? Glorious things of thee are spoken. That's also the tune to the German national anthem. Did you know that? Now you do. As young Mennonite women served these new arrivals with platters of Twebak and Schinkenfleisch, which is ham, a FASPA. For Mennonites, this was a joyous moment for a number of reasons. First, they believed that these troops would provide relief from the scourge of lawlessness, anarchy, and banditry that had enveloped much of Russia and Ukraine following the Bolshevik takeover of power and that vacuum of that new sovereign state of Ukraine. So they believed this would finally bring order to this anarchy and banditry, and that's where we get Nestor Makhnov is one of these names of an anarchist that still lives in the nightmares of many Canadian Mennonites. Second, they feared that the rising socialist tide in the local Ukrainian and Russian population, they feared the rising socialist tide in the local Ukrainian and Russian population because that population had a strong desire for land. And remember how much land and wealth the Mennonites had at that time. And thirdly, some Mennonites felt an affinity with the German cultural identity represented by these new occupiers. Even though they spoke German, they would not have considered themselves culturally German at the time in terms of ethnicity. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, and I think that's interesting. But this enthusiastic welcome proved to be a tactical error in the long term. While the Mennonites had demonstrated a strong political sophistication, and I shared that in the other lectures, in late Imperial Russia, they now showed their blind spots. Ukrainians and Russians, many of whom bitterly opposed, that's their neighbors, many of them who bitterly opposed a foreign occupation by German and Austrian-Hungarian soldiers. So you've got occupation, so you don't like occupation, first of all. And those that supported the reforms promised by the Bolsheviks witnessed their fellow citizens now embracing foreign enemy troops on their own soil. Not a good move. Undoubtedly, this seemed to confirm earlier prejudices about Germans promoted by Russian nationalists and fueled by years of war. It's important to place this moment in a larger context because it happened towards the end of the First World War, but early in the struggle for survival of the new Bolshevik communist regime. World War I marked a dividing point for many people around the world because it introduced a new and destructive way of doing war. People hadn't seen this sort of total war before. A war that didn't necessarily always discriminate between those in uniform and those who were simply, what do you call them? Civilians. And now we see that again. We see, and if you see some of the pictures of like the fighting in Bakhmut, the reference is almost always, this looks like World War I trench warfare. Interesting. The war obliterated the historic distinction between military and civilian populations. It rearranged global political power relationships as old powers faded away. So after World War I, we no longer have any country. Well, we might have some countries that have the name empire behind them, but the Ottoman Empire slowly goes away. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire is broken apart, and those sort of things. And of course, you have the Treaty of Versailles that really puts the screws onto Germany for a long time, and maybe the result of World War II. And the war set into motion the development of new politicians who introduced totalitarianism, who said things like, there is so much disorder in this world, I will bring order. You just need to trust me. Give me your power and trust me that I will do good things. Whether it was on the left or the right, because you get both Hitler and you get both Stalin and Hitler coming out of this. And of course, they end up fighting each other. World War I ended the 1800s, which in some respects had been a period of relative peace, not of total peace, but of relative peace and progress in Europe. And it inaugurated the 1900s, which was plagued by unprecedented military destruction. And the 1900s all the way to 2000 has been one of wars, an incredibly destructive set of world wars, or Iraq or Afghanistan. Millions and millions and millions of people were killed in the 1900s. So World War I sits sort of as a hinge to those two centuries. Now, at the start of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Mennonites in Russia and Ukraine lived, as we talked about earlier, in the Golden Age, a golden age of prosperity. But by the end of the Civil War, so the end of World War I and the Civil War, the Mennonites don't really get a break. But by the end of that Civil War, which ends with a Bolshevik victory, Lenin, and of course the communists are fighting amongst themselves, and you have Trotsky who ends up in Mexico, and Lenin chases him down and kills him in Mexico and all that stuff. And finally the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, who are Marxists, and of course the battle is over which Marxism is going to win, takes over, becomes the absolute ruler of what is now called the Soviet Union. So no longer is it the Russian Empire or the Tsarist Empire, it is the Soviet Union. Anyways, the Mennonites were a devastated people. They come from a golden age to a devastated people in a matter of just a few short years, whose economic base has been shattered. And the war sets into motion events from which Mennonite communities in Ukraine and Russia will never fully recover. And we still feel that trauma even in members of our own church. And I think Kim Entz, who is watching, is deeply informed by that trauma. Now, her people were there through World War II yet. So, let's talk about a topic called patriotism and World War I. You see, the Mennonites, at the beginning of World War I, most of them would have thought of themselves as loyal citizens of Russia. For example, the district administrator of a Mennonite settlement sent a telegram to Tsar Nicholas II to express his joy at the patriotism shown by his Mennonites. He wrote, quote, "It was a joy to see and to hear the enthusiastic and patriotic willingness displayed by the many present," those would be Mennonites, "who stood up and with loud words announced, 'We want to and we can help. Now and in the future, we are faithful subjects of our beloved fatherland in Russia.'" So, a lot like the U.S. Mennonites, who said, they refused to fight. Many did in World War I here, but they still said, well, we're still Americans. Well, the ones in Russia at the time said, well, we are Russians. Kind of interesting. Anyways, Mennonites helped by sending money for the care of the sick and the wounded soldiers, as well as dried fruit, feather pillows, transport wagons, flour, sheets, and clothing. They also allocated rooms in Mennonite hospitals for the care of the war wounded. Since the introduction of universal military service in the 1870s, and that's why our Mennonites moved from that area to here, they didn't want to be forced to do any sort of service. But since the introduction of that in the 1870s, Mennonites had engaged in forestry work as a form of alternative service. But during World War I, they saw a new form of alternative service develop as Mennonites started working in hospitals and as orderlies on medical trains. And there you can just basically see kind of what a train looked like. Or they worked on the front lines in hospitals. Here they are on the Turkish front line. But they worked right in the middle of, right in the heat of the battle. While Mennonites considered both tasks, both the forestry work and the medical work to be acceptable work, many leaders endorsed medical care on the trains as a more meaningful form of service to the fatherland. Of the 12,000 Mennonite men called up for service in the Russian army during World War I, 12,000 Russian Mennonite men who were called up, drafted during World War I, and I wish I would have done the research to see how many Mennonite men in the U.S. were drafted. I'm sure it wasn't quite 12,000. I don't know that, though. 6,000 went into the medical service, so about half went into medical service. And 4,000 of those 6,000 served on those medical trains, while others were assigned to hospitals. By 1917, the Russian Red Cross operated around 75 hospital trains that would go to the front and bring soldiers back, and then back and forth, constantly. Many Mennonites staffed these trains. But as the war continued, some Mennonite military officials became uneasy about sending Mennonite servicemen to the front because of their German background, and also in their belief of non-resistance and non-violence, that they wouldn't in the end pick up a gun and kill a German. The demonstrations of Mennonite loyalty went largely unheeded because some government officials, as well as Russian nationalists, encouraged a widespread smear campaign to incriminate those of German background. Now remember, the Mennonites weren't the only Germans in the area. They were part of a large German immigration that had been brought over by Catherine the Great. So you have Volga Germans, you have Mennonite Germans, you have Lutheran Germans, Catholic Germans, all living in what's called New Russia, what they called New Russia. Already in 1889, as the Mennonites celebrated their centennial in the Russian Empire with ringing declarations of loyalty, A.A. Poltov, an avid Russian nationalist, began publishing an influential series of anti-German tracts and books. And there you can see the cover of one. That there is the Kaiser. You know that by his mustache and his pointy hat, and of course by his devilish feet and devilish tail, because I don't know what the nickname was for Germans in Russian, but what was it here in the U.S.? The Hun, right? So there you have a picture of the Hun, and what do? They draw in all these towns and cities and Obviously, there's death involved. You just can't trust a German. Interesting how patriotism always points the other as something other than human. He argued that the German colonies in New Russia, Ukraine, constituted a threat to the integrity of Russia. Poltov saw Europe dividing into two large opposing camps. Oh my, history repeats itself. Two large opposing camps that were fated to struggle with each other. One, the first group is Germanic Roman, that's basically Western, versus Slavic Eastern. So we have this Western-Eastern debate, and again, Putin is drumming that rhythm again. Of course, he argued, the Germans would be loyal to their own kind. Remember what we did in the U.S. with the Japanese American citizens? Well, they're Japanese. I know they're citizens, but in the end, when push comes to shove, they're going to fight for Japan, so we got to put them in little camps. Well, that's what this guy was talking about, our German people. Same thing. Push comes to shove, a German was always a German. You can't breed that out of them, no matter what they say or do. While such attitudes simmered towards the end of the century, World War I deepened their hold, encouraging a vitriolic outpouring of animosity and outrage to all things German. And again, you can find all sorts of things like that online. Now, World War I not only exacerbated anti-German sentiment, but it also aggravated other long-held grievances in Russian society. Now listen to this phrase. See if this sounds familiar. The inability of the Russian Empire to effectively wage war. Does that sound familiar? Again, nothing new under the sun. The inability of the Russian Empire to effectively wage war ignited these grievances. They had victories, but at massive cost during World War I and World War II, and again today in Ukraine, which had been growing throughout much of the 1800s. In Russia, the carnage of war exacerbated social, economic, national, geographic, and political divisions that eventually collapsed the empire. And these divisions and tensions forced the abdication then of Tsar Nicholas II, the friend of the Mennonites, in February of 1917. Followed by this abdication, there was a provisional government set up. So another government. Russia engaged in an intense national debate over the need of political and economic reform and social restructuring. Where do we go from here? The Tsar didn't work. What sort of system do we put in place? And of course, there were 5 million different ideas, and they were all willing to fight about it. It's fascinating that some of these debates were replicated within Mennonite society starting in 1917. Remember, many young men were studying in the major universities of Russia. So they knew what the debates were, and they brought those debates home. Among the Mennonites, there are interesting hints of generational confrontation between a younger, more liberal generation spearheaded by returning servicemen and students. Sounds a lot like World War II and the Mennonites coming home from CPS. They had seen the world. They had seen the destruction. They had seen a whole bunch of things. They had learned in the universities. Now this generation comes home and finds themselves at conflict with the Mennonite leadership in the colonies, who is much more conservative, much more insular. And so they have these massive debates, and they develop these congresses and conferences where they debate, how are we going to do a better welfare system? How are we going to have a better system of land distribution? Because we also have problems of land in our own colonies. Remember that from the last lecture. The percentage of landless was much higher in Mennonites than the non-Mennonites. So some of that classism is also going on. And so they're debating that. But all of this becomes academic when, as the entire Russian landscape is changed, when the Bolsheviks seize power in late 1917. And this event, Lenin finally taking over, initiates new and shocking real changes in Mennonite society of which they will never recover. The Bolshevik Revolution endorsed class warfare and the expropitiation, that means the forceful taking by the government, of wealth. And remember, we saw pictures at the end of last lecture about the lifestyles that many Mennonites, or the most visible Mennonites at least, lived, right? I remember you, Steve, saying, those are houses? So imagine then a peasant Bolshevik saying, those are houses? And they're living at a different level. And so you get a sort of a class, you do get a massive class warfare going on, and the taking away of land and wealth. Furthermore, this revolution also legitimizes attacks on all forms of authority, especially the church, giving license to violent destruction. And the revolution created a social dynamic in which it attacked existing orders, and it just sort of grew larger and larger and larger. You see this in several other revolutions, but people were killed and tortured, and pretty soon, even if your neighbor wasn't a kulak, a wealthy person, but you didn't like him, you told him, you told on him in front of the council, and he got out and he got sent out and shot. But it develops into this, and you also have anarchists who don't want any sort of government running around creating issues. And also, the prisons had been emptied out at the time. So you have some very dynamic leaders who are psychopathic running around organizing groups as well. So there's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of banditry, there's a lot of anarchy, quite literally. And the Mennonites are caught in this. And in this case, this revolution, of all of this stuff that I just described, this revolution gave license to German ethnophobia, which had been a huge part of the Russian World War I. So they've been ramping up about how bad the Germans are. They had just gotten their tails kicked by the Germans. Who are they going to take out their anger and their vigilantism and their anarchism? Who are they going to take it out on? The Germans. So let's go beat them up and take away their stuff. As historian Paul Taves writes, quote, social revolutions frequently have a legitimate basis, but they can also create their own psychopathology among large segments of the population. All these impulses were released in late 1917 and 1918, end of quote. So all of this sets the context for that heartfelt adulation and welcome in Hauptstadt when the German troops step off of the train. And these Mennonites welcome them. Why? The appearance of these German soldiers provided a relief from the social, political, and economic disorder that the Mennonites had experienced. As Peter J. Brown, the archivist of Mleczna Colony, wrote to his brother Abraham regarding the arrival of these troops, quote, this was an experience. Our train station has never, even during the first days of mobilization for World War I, seen a gathering of people as on that 19th of April. Little wonder. First of all, they were German. Secondly, they had saved us in the hour of our greatest need. Our joy was certainly severe, and our welcome of them was profoundly heartfelt. The entire military cohort, some 800 men, was put up for the night in private homes in Hauptstadt, Neuhauptstadt, and Muntau. We showed them all the love and friendliness of which we were capable. I do believe these people, primarily Rhinelanders from the River Rhine in Germany, enjoyed themselves in our midst. And these imperial German occupiers, who have gotten this land through treaty, viewed the German colonists, including the Mennonites, as potential allies. And in fact, not in this picture, maybe in a previous picture I had, they had them celebrate German cultural events where they would, like, I don't know if Oktoberfest, but, those sort of events that the Mennonites wouldn't have had before. But they felt like these were our people. On both sides, both of them said, I think these could be our people. During the occupation, the Imperial German Military Administration Oh, well, let's start. These imperial German occupiers viewed the German colonists, including the Mennonites, as potential allies. During the occupation, the imperial German military administration gave considerable support to German and Mennonite inhabitants in the region. Now remember that, because this is going to come back to haunt them. Remember, we talked about this being a tactical failure. For example, while simultaneously disarming the Ukrainian neighbors, taking their guns from them and disarming them, they favored the Germans and Mennonites by allocating their troops to them for defense against the roving bandits and anarchists, even supplying arms and organizing and training self-defense units. We'll talk about that, even amongst the Mennonites, for a little bit of time. They also assisted the German colonists in reclaiming property that had earlier been appropriated by the Bolshevik peasants. So can you see the dynamic? Can you feel the dynamic even that's going on here? And in all of this, you just don't know what tomorrow holds, but you know that all of this has happened in a matter of just a few months, and in some cases a year, 2 years, but most of this in just a few months. And we're going to talk a little bit about that next week. Well, needless to say, this favored treatment had consequences. During this occupation, the pro-German position of many Mennonites shifted, and this is where it's, I think, very interesting, and this is where it's very interesting for those of us who say, I come from German background. Because I think a lot of times, I see this a lot, and we just say it generically, oh yeah, I come from German background. Well, really, most Russian Mennonites were not German ethnically. They were Dutch, or Frisian, but they were never Germanic. But they spoke German, and they read German. And so this is an interesting shift that I'm going to denote here for us to think about. Because it's really interesting, too, about maybe what the definitions are of any nationality. What if you're a Russian-speaking Ukrainian? What if you are a Ukrainian Russian? What if you're a Ukrainian or a Russian? What does that mean? What does that mean, and where do those sort of lines and thoughts come from of how we define who we are? The pro-German position of many Mennonites shifted from a cultural association, sharing a language, to a more political allegiance to Germany. Do you see that shift? That's a major shift. Because nationalism is still a major movement in all of this, trying to define what is a nation state, what is a people, who are we in the midst of all of this. So Mennonites shifted from a cultural association, having studied in their university, sharing a language in some cases, to a more political allegiance to Germany. That's also going to nip them in the rear end after World War II. And we're going to talk about that, because then all of a sudden they wanted nothing to do as German culturalists, because if they were German, they couldn't have escaped, MCC couldn't have taken them out of Europe to Paraguay. Different point. The first taste of Bolshevism and anarchism caused Mennonites who previously thought of themselves as loyal subjects of Russia to rethink their political identification. We haven't had to do that. It has come close. I know the story. Annette isn't here. I know the story after Krikahanis John Schrag was taken to Burton, and he was almost lynched by an anti-Mennonite mob in Burton. When he came back, there was serious discussion about picking up and leaving and going to Mexico by that group over there in Mount Ridge, because if they don't want us here, even though we've done all these things, we built the Blaze Fork, we did all of these things, and they don't want us here, then we'll go somewhere else. You don't see a lot of that during World War I here in the U.S., but you definitely did see it in World War I for the Russians and the Mennonites, to rethink their political identification. Beginning with the Russification policies, remember in 1870s, we got to make these immigrants more Russian, more American, more Paraguayan, more Canadian, more, wherever you go, that drum beat is always there. Beginning with the Russification policies of the 1870s, Mennonites had begun to refer to themselves as Folklein, a small people or a nation in and of themselves. And that's where we also start getting this confusion. I mean, it's coming before, but it really starts settling this confusion when people say, what makes a Mennonite? I have heard people say, I'm a secular Mennonite. What the heck is a secular Mennonite? But my guess is most people would probably define themselves secularly as a Mennonite first, because I speak a language, I eat a certain food, ethnically. And yet most Mennonites in the world are not European. So what is a Mennonite? So that's where we get this confusion. Is it ethnicity? Is it a what? I know on the carnets in Bolivia where they, the green cards or I don't know what your citizen documents, it has to say your ethnicity. My ethnicity said I'm American, whatever that means. I come from the U.S., but ethnically, what's an American, right? Mennonites had Mennonita on there as their ethnicity. That's interesting, isn't it? And then, especially for Bolivians, if you really wanted to blow their mind, you would say, no, there are 3 Mennonite churches in Santa Cruz alone that all they do is speak Spanish and they don't know a drop of German. Poof. Well, a lot of this comes out of this time when Mennonites began to refer to themselves as a Folklein, a Volkslein, a small group of people or a nation, a state within a state, or another language they often talk about is the Mennonite Commonwealth of Russia. Think of the ramifications of that sort of language, where they wish to preserve against the intrusion of the state. And this became a sense of a peoplehood. And they could base this theologically, like on the chosen people, right? There's this always idea in the Bible of the remnant, of the chosen people, of the holy people, the people of God. And so they start using that sort of language as well to set themselves apart. And you see that same sort of instinct still among our more traditional brothers and sisters. That's their goal in moving further and further away from the world, where they can get the privileges they need to be their own people. They'll do what they need to do in order to live in that land, but to be their own isolated people. This sense of peoplehood besieged during World War I and its aftermath now found common links to the German nation and to the German people. And that change and that thing became a bane to their existence. And needless to say, this favored treatment had consequences, especially when the German forces were forced to withdraw from Ukraine. And it was once again a free-for-all, and the civil war of Russia continued. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more next week. Wow, we stopped early. Any questions or comments or confusion or...
The comments you made about the Mennonites being their own people, or I think you might have even said a people without a country, brought to mind the Israelites.
Exactly.
They were without a country until, 1957?
Yep.
When the United Nations said, okay, here, we'll give you...
Yeah, so that those images would be the images that they would connect with. This idea of what's the verse? We are pilgrims and strangers in a strange land. That's a verse that they often use. I should have looked up what it was. It's from the Bible, but it's one they often quote. It's one they often quote. We are strangers and we are pilgrims and strangers in this world, and that's how they viewed the material world, their existence within it, and also their interaction with others. And
Because the Israelites are also God's chosen.
yes, exactly.
And they did not have a country. Mennonites.
Yep.
We all know Mennonites are God's chosen people.
Well, exactly.
And we are with that.
You got the point. No, that's and you get people that talk like that. And so then when Hitler does come around and he starts talking about a Lebensraum, a place where we can all live, a space that we can all live as German people, as people like we should be, Germanic and Christian, or what for him was quasi-Christian, blonde and blue-eyed, and we'll see this. Where did he go to set up that Lebensraum first? Well, he went Austria and then Czechoslovakia or whatever, but it was to the Ukraine again, and we're going to talk about that. But the Ukraine was going to be where he gathered all these people, and actually more and more research is coming out about how some of these Mennonites collaborated with the Nazis when they came in again. And again, you have to, and I think it's very easy for us to be judgmental and say, why would you do that? But again, I think the context I'm trying to set up, if you are stuck in a place where you are being raided, and we're going to learn this, where a whole village gets lined up around a table, or a whole family gets lined up around a table, and they go around, and the anarchists go around and chop off the heads of everybody and then set them on the table in front of them like they would set the table, versus order from a group of people that sing your songs, that speak your language. Where are you going to lean in a moment of deep terror? And you know, the unfortunate thing is there is documentation that when we get to World War II where Mennonites were on the front line of helping Goebbels and Hitler and some of those people implement some of the last, some of the final solution and those sort of things. So that's where it gets really messy too. But again, when we heard Mr. Friesen in our church. For him, World War II was Russia and Germany. They didn't know about Great Britain, or they didn't care, because the bombing was coming from Russia, and they knew that if they went, deeper into German territory or over there somewhere, the Russians couldn't get them. And if you are just trying to survive, and you've been through just horrific things, you don't have the luxury of sitting and thinking 5 moves ahead. That's not to forgive some of the grievous sins that they did do, but it's to kind of show the context in which they were in.
It does limit your moral decision.
Oh, and your creativity. I mean, when you got flight and
Survival versus
yep,
morality.
absolutely. So yeah, what would you do? I mean, and you're making tough decisions. I mean, we'll get to that when the Mennonite, there is a small group of Mennonites that start a self-defense unit, and they fight against some of these anarchists and kill some of them. Some of them come around and say, no, I wish I would have never done that. I sent a few of those guys to hell, and that judgment is on me. And that was the way they thought. And others were like, man, especially the young men were like, no, man, I am not going to stand here and watch my mother and sister get raped. So these people are dealing with some pretty heavy stuff in the midst of governments changing every other day, and it's a time where it's not just governments changing like we have Republican to Democrat to Republican. It's systems like the Bolsheviks come in and they try to undo everything top from bottom, and marriages are split up, churches are split up, everyone is and everything is directed, and they move everyone to we get to Stalin, everything is collectivized and everything. I mean, it's a major upheaval to a group of people. And meanwhile, we have us who have come here in 1870s running the risk of becoming judgmental and saying, well, had you guys been able to leave like we did and didn't stick around and become so rich, you wouldn't be in such trouble now. And that happens in documentation, and they feel the judgment of it. Sorry, I talked more again. What else? I'll do it later. Yes, sir.
I want to throw one story in there.
Let's get the mic in.
My dad told me this story, and
he said over there, they all had picket fences. The Mennonites, you lived on both sides of the street. That was the town, and you had picket fences. When they were getting raided, to protect the colony at night, they had put the young men out there to guard the place. But these young men were so scared, and they would have a stick or something for defense, and they would be going along the picket fence and making noise, and you could tell exactly where they were at.
Because of the sound on there. Yeah.
So,
We will talk about some of those events coming up next time. I'll try not to be graphic. It can get pretty graphic. Our goal is not to become graphic, except to share what happened for a lot of these people. And what does it mean to say, oh, God is great and God is good? God is good all the time, God is good. It's easy for us to say, but how does someone say that in the midst of that? How does a Ukrainian, and I want to mention this, Aaron just texted me and asked that I mentioned this as a prayer concern. A major apartment building in Ukraine by a mall was hit today in Zaporozhye. So people we're connected to. Zaporozhye is right there in the old colony. What does it mean to say God is great and God is good? We'll think and pray for you. They are. From what I understand, hits have been. They live on the other side of the river from the main part of Zaporozhye. They live on the other side of the river, but places have been hit around them there. Yeah. Well, I think the kids are here. And we don't want to scare them with the stories. Yeah, exactly. And I'm not saying you can't say God is great and God is good, but it's